The notice came on a Tuesday, which Rail always thought was the wrong day for things to matter. Mondays carried the weight of fresh starts. Wednesdays split the week cleanly in half. Tuesdays were for maintenance requests and inventory audits, and the low-grade administrative tedium that filled the margins of a posting like Viridian 9, where the red dust worked its way into every seal and hinge, and the training cycles ran on their patient loop, and the most dramatic event of the previous month had been a generator fault that took the mess kitchen offline for 36 hours, compelling everyone to eat ration packs in collective, silent solidarity. Captain Rail Doran had been staring at the notice for 20 minutes before he read it a second time, as though the words might rearrange themselves into something less absurd. Subject, transfer and remedial assignment, effective immediately. From Galactic Coalition Fleet Command, Personnel Division, Sector 7. To Doran Rail Human Combat Instructor, Outpost Viridian 9. Per Directive 44C, Coalition Standards for Non-Combat Personnel, the following individual has been assessed as unfit for active field deployment and is hereby transferred to your remedial instruction program pending reassessment in 12 standard months. The individual is Vale Ssyrith, female, adult, vel-kethara species. Former assignment, Auxiliary Combat Division, 3rd Fleet. Reason for transfer: repeated failure to demonstrate requisite combat thresholds. Physical assessment, significantly below baseline for species average. Psychological assessment, reactive stress disorder, mild. Recommendation from Supervising Officer, Commander Haveth Drawal, 3rd Fleet, reassignment to administrative post or honorable discharge. Coordinator note: human remedial instruction is considered a last measure and carries no guarantee of return to active duty. Rail set the notice down on his desk. Outside his window, if window was the right word for the reinforced viewport that overlooked Viridian 9 training yard, the morning sun was cutting long shadows across the red dust. 3 of his current trainees were running a circuit drill. He could hear the thud of their boots, the ragged synchronicity of it, the way one of them, a young Tharkan male named Kas, was already favoring his left leg. Rail had told Kas about that leg twice. Tomorrow he would tell him again. He picked the notice back up. Reassignment to administrative post or honorable discharge. That was the polite coalition way of writing someone off. He'd seen it before. He'd been on the receiving end of it once, a long time ago, in a different life, before Viridian 9 and before the dust and before he'd learned that the people they wrote off were almost never the ones who needed to be. He filed a reply. Subject RE, transfer and remedial assignment. To Personnel Division, Sector 7. Understood, accepted. Send her when you're ready. Vale Ssyrith arrived on a coalition transport that was 3 hours late and smelled of recycled air, and too many soldiers eating ration packs in an enclosed space. She was the last one off the ramp. Rail was waiting at the base of it. He'd been watching the others disembark, 2 new Kethani soldiers being transferred to a garrison post further inland, a civilian contractor hauling survey equipment, and then there was a pause, and then she came down. She was not what he'd pictured. He hadn't let himself picture much as a rule but what he had assembled from the transfer notice, significantly below baseline for species average, reactive stress disorder, repeatedly failed thresholds, had suggested someone small and shaken and maybe a little defeated. He'd been prepared for that. He'd worked with defeated before. She was small, yes. The vel-kethara ran lean and long-limbed, and Vale was no exception, perhaps a few centimeters taller than him, her frame the kind of fine bone that looked assembled for speed rather than mass. Her skin was the characteristic pale copper of her species, warm in the afternoon light, with the faint iridescent sheen along her forearms and collarbones that flared gently when she moved. Her hair was dark and cut practically short at the sides, longer at the crown, and her eyes large. The irises a deep amber shot through with threads of pale gold, were scanning the yard with the careful precision of someone who mapped exits before she entered rooms. She was not defeated. She was watchful. There was a difference. She stopped at the base of the ramp and looked at him, and he looked back, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "Instructor Doran," she said finally. Her coalition standard was accented but precise. The vel-kethara had a way of putting slightly too much weight on consonants, as if each word was a decision. "That's me," he said. "Welcome to Viridian 9. He didn't put out his hand. He'd learned years ago that not every species used contact greeting, and the vel-kethara weren't among those that did. "You have bags." "One," she lifted it. It was a small pack, worn at the straps. It did not look like the bag of someone who planned to be here long. "Good, less to carry." He turned toward the outpost. "Mess is at 1800. I'll show you the bunk block and the training schedule tonight. We start at 0500. She fell into step beside him without being told to. He noted that. "I read the schedule they forwarded," she said. "And you start with physical conditioning, an hour before combat drill." "That's right." "My conditioning scores were adequate." A pause. "They were adequate before the reassessment." "I didn't ask about your scores." He glanced at her sidelong. "I asked about nothing yet. That starts tomorrow." She absorbed that with a short, controlled blink. Commander Drawl said this program was a formality, that the most likely outcome was administrative reassignment. "Commander Drawl isn't here." "No," she agreed, and there was something so carefully neutral in her voice that Rael made a note of it. The neutrality of someone who had a great many things to say about Commander Drawl and had decided not to say any of them. He filed that away too. The first week he watched. That was always step one. Not running drills, not testing limits, not building a curriculum. Watching. What did she do when she thought no one was looking? What did she do when she was sure they were? The gap between those two versions of a person was, in Rael's experience, where everything real lived. He had learned this the hard way, on a different posting, with a different kind of trainee. He had spent 6 months running a young Kethani soldier named Orvith through standard curriculum before noticing, one evening, by pure accident, through the mess hall window, that Orvith was doing hand-to-hand drills against a supply crate in the dark. Not the assigned drills. Something different, something he'd clearly been developing on his own, a fluid sequence that bore no resemblance to the Coalition standard manual. When Rael had gone out and asked him about it, Orvith had gone rigid with the particular fear of someone who expects to be told off for color outside the lines. It turned out he'd been an informal wrestling champion among his community before enlisting, a style specific to his home region, and had been quietly burying it under standard form because no one had asked. They'd spent the next 6 months building on it. Orvith was now a senior combat specialist in the 2nd Fleet, which was its own kind of answer. The lesson, look at what's there, not what the file says is there, what's actually specifically there. He watched Vale. She woke before the alarm every morning. He knew because the motion sensor on the bunk block door logged the first open at 04:12, nearly 50 minutes before the compound stirred. He checked the yard camera and found her out there in the pre-dawn dark, running. Not the assigned route, a longer one, twice the perimeter, methodical and silent and completely alone. The yard security lighting caught the faint iridescent sheen of her forearms as she moved, brief flickers of it in the dark, and she ran without breaking pace for the full 20 minutes he watched. She ate quickly and without preference, whatever was on the table, as if the meal was a task to be completed rather than an experience to have. She ate near the end of the mess table, not at the far end. She was not specifically avoiding the others, but she had a quality of containing herself, of occupying precisely the space assigned to her and no more. In group drills she was careful, not slow, she was never slow, but she held back. He could see it in the set of her shoulders, in the way she calculated every movement just slightly before she committed to it. She was performing competence rather than expressing it, which were entirely different things. She had learned, over what he suspected was years, to show only what would not be held against her. Every rep was sized to pass without standing out. Every response in the tactical briefing was measured to be correct, but not too correct. She had internalized a ceiling and was living right under it, and doing so with such practiced ease that he suspected she had stopped noticing the ceiling was there. She had been training herself to be less than she was. He recognized it because he had done the same thing, once, not in combat training but in a different context, under a different kind of authority that had a similar effect, and he had spent a very long time thinking that the ceiling was the sky before someone had shown him otherwise. He did not, however, tell Vale this during the first week. Week 1 was for watching. The rest came later. In solo work she was different. On the third day, he watched her run the obstacle circuit alone after the others had cleared out. She didn't know he was in the observation bay above, or she didn't act as though she knew, which was either the same thing or a more interesting thing. She ran it twice, the assigned version, clean and efficient, and then she paused at the start point for a long moment, standing very still in the late afternoon light, and he could almost see her making a decision. Then she ran it again, but differently. She'd redesigned it on the fly, skipping 2 of the standard rest points, adding a second-story traverse that wasn't on the layout, taking the midsection at a diagonal angle that cut 15 seconds off the route, but required her to clear a gap that was half a meter wider than the standard jump. She fell on the traverse the first time, hit the mat hard, rolled, came up in a crouch. Sat there for exactly 3 seconds, then got back to the start point and ran it again. Made it, cleared the traverse with perhaps 2 centimeters to spare, landed clean and kept moving. He wrote in his log, "Does not fall to stay fallen," not showing me what she can do but showing herself. Designed that modification herself, tactically sound, not reckless. Has spatial assessment and willingness to innovate she is not displaying in group. Why not? He already knew the answer, but he wrote the question down because it was the kind of question that needed to stay visible. On the 5th day, he sparred with her. He chose a paired drill that looked like an assessment exercise, a standard block encounter sequence, but he broke from it after the first 30 seconds and just fought her instead. Not to injury, but honestly. She adapted faster than most instructors he'd had. Not immediately. The first 10 seconds she was looking for the assigned pattern and not finding it, and he could read the confusion in her footwork. But then something shifted. Her stance dropped. Her eyes changed, went from tracking his hands to tracking his center mass. And she hit him once in the 4th rib with enough force that he actually had to breathe through it. Then she stepped back and went very still, and he could see from her expression that she was waiting for him to be angry. He nodded, "Good. We'll work on that shoulder rotation tomorrow. You're telegraphing the follow-through. But that was a real hit." He paused. "Did anyone tell you it was?" She blinked. "That I was telegraphing. That you landed a real hit." A longer pause. "No. Consider it told." The first month was structure. He rebuilt her conditioning from the ground up, not because it was poor, but because she had learned to limit it. Every rep she did had a ceiling on it, a point where she pulled back, and he spent the first 4 weeks simply teaching her to take those ceilings off. It was not always smooth. There was a session in the 3rd week where he pushed the weights past her self-reported limit, and she set the bar down after the first set and told him, in a very controlled voice, that she understood her own body and that exceeding safe parameters was not the same as progress. He leaned against the rack and waited her out. "Say that again," he said, "but this time say what you actually mean." She stared at him. You said I understand my own body. You meant I know what I'm allowed to do. Those aren't the same thing." He crossed his arms. "What does Drawl's voice sound like in your head right now?" Her jaw tightened. Thought so, Rail said. He was not unkind about it. He'd had the same voice in his own head, once, a different name, a different rank, but the same architecture of doubt dressed up as caution. You can take the ceiling off for one set. If the form breaks, we stop. But I want you to find out where your actual limit is, not where someone told you it was. She was quiet for a long time. Then she picked the bar back up. She completed 3 sets, not 1. After the session, she sat on a bench with her forearms on her knees and her head bowed, and her iridescent markings were lit across her collarbones, bright, shifting, the vel-kethara equivalent of a flush. She was breathing hard, and she was, he suspected, trying to figure out what she was feeling. He had noticed this about her. She approached her own emotions the way she approached tactical problems, with rigor, wanting to understand them precisely before she acted on them. "Good session," he said, passing her a water pack. She caught it without looking up, drank, set it on the bench beside her. Then she said, "I've been doing this wrong." "You've been trained by people who needed you small." "Why would anyone?" She stopped. "Small things don't challenge them," Rail said simply. "Don't make them look at what they built. Easier to call it your limit than their failure." He leaned against the wall of the training bay and crossed his arms, not unkindly. "You are not the first person I've sat where you're sitting who got here with a file full of someone else's inadequacy written in their name. You won't be the last." She looked up at him then. Something was moving in her amber eyes that he didn't have a name for yet, not gratitude, not exactly. More like someone carefully testing whether a door they'd been told was locked might actually open. Testing not whether they could open it, but whether the lock had ever been real in the first place. By the 2nd month, she was not the same woman who had come down the transport ramp. It showed in small ways first. She stopped hesitating at the start of the obstacle circuit. She stopped apologizing when her sparring landed clean. She started asking questions in briefings, direct, precise questions that often caught Rail off guard by going exactly to the places he'd been going to address next. She had, it became clear, an excellent tactical mind. She had probably always had it. She had just been very thoroughly discouraged from using it. He noticed the change most clearly one morning when she came to the weapons rack before the session and picked up a practice blade, turned it over once in her hand, and set it down again. "Wrong weight," she said. For what I'm trying to do." She looked at the rack with the calm assessment she was learning to apply to things. The standard vel-kethara auxiliary issue runs 60 grams heavier than this. But the 7th Fleet Special Operations Equipment List has a lighter build, 65 grams lighter than the auxiliary standard. If I'm testing for a field deployment application, the weight here is correct for neither context. She glanced at him. "Do we have the ops list specification?" He looked at her for a moment. She waited without anxiety, just waiting for an answer. "I'll order them," he said. "Thank you." She picked up the closest available alternative and began her warm-up. Practical, efficient, completely matter-of-fact, as if the ability to assess and request what she needed was something she had always done. She had not, 3 weeks ago, been able to do that. She had been making do with whatever was handed to her and saying nothing about it. The other trainees noticed. Cass, who had by now sorted out his left leg and grown both faster and slightly humbler as a result, told Rail one morning at mess that the vel-kethara woman had run the night circuit at a time he hadn't thought was possible. "I checked the sensor log," he said, sounding mildly resentful. "She beat my personal record by 11 seconds. "Did she know you had that record?" Cass thought about it. "I don't think so." "Then she wasn't running against you." "What was she running against?" Rail considered. "Yesterday," he said. He started designing specialized sessions for her. The vel-kethara were built for agility over brute force, longer limbs, a lower center of gravity, reflexes calibrated for sudden directional change. He had sparred with vel-kethara veterans, and the ones who knew how to use their biology were genuinely frightening. They fought like water, like something that found the gaps in a defense rather than breaking through the front of it. Vale had been trained to fight like a shorter, slower version of species that used force, which meant she'd been trained wrong, and she'd been failing at something she was never supposed to be doing. He brought in archived footage of 3 vel-kethara combat masters. 2 of them retired, 1 deceased. The archival quality varied. The oldest recordings were grainy and spliced from different angles, but the content was clear. He'd spent 2 weeks tracking these down through the Coalition's combat history library, cross-referencing declassified special operations records and an academic database on species-specific martial tradition. The librarian who'd helped him had seemed mildly baffled by the request and had asked whether this was for a historical study. Rael had said yes, which was not entirely untrue. She watched all 6 hours of it without moving, sitting cross-legged on the floor of the media room, her eyes fixed on the screen with an intensity that made him feel obscurely, like he was watching someone recognize something they had forgotten they knew. He sat behind her, off to the side, watching the screen and watching her reaction to it in equal measure. The combat masters moved the way water moved. That was the only way to describe it to someone who hadn't seen it. Not the forward pressure model of Kethani fighting, the mass and momentum approach that the Coalition's standardized curriculum was built around. This was about angle and gap, and the art of not being where the strike was going. The smallest of the 3 masters, a woman named Commander Vale Ssyrith, now retired, who had at her peak been considered the finest vel-kethara field operative in the 5th Fleet, was half the weight of the opponents in the training footage and moved through them like she was flowing through water. She did not fight hard. She fought true. Vale's markings flickered twice during the footage. Just twice, and barely visible in the dark room, but he noticed. "This is different," she said when it ended. Her voice was very quiet. "From what they taught you." "From everything they taught me." She turned to look at him. The light in the room caught her forearm markings and turned them briefly to gold. "Why would they teach us to fight like Kethani? We're half their mass." "Because the instructor cadre was mostly Kethani and they only knew one template," he shrugged. "It's a Coalition problem. Standardization is efficient until it meets things that aren't standard." "I'm not standard." "None of you are, but you especially." He paused. "You were told that was a flaw." She was quiet for a long moment. Outside the media room, someone was crossing the corridor, from the sound of the footsteps, always slightly heavier on the left than the right even now. The sound passed and faded, and the room was very still. "Yes," she said, and then more quietly, "I believed them." She said it with the careful deliberateness of someone who had been carrying a thing for a long time and had decided in this moment to set it down in the light and look at it. "For years, I thought the problem was me. The gap between my scores and the baseline, I thought that was my failure. I worked harder. I pushed the drills further. And I still couldn't close the gap, and I didn't understand." She stopped. "I didn't understand that I was running a race on someone else's course, against someone else's body type, on someone else's rules, and calling it my shortcoming. I know. Do you know why I'm telling you this?" He considered. "Because believing it and saying it out loud are different things, and you're testing whether the room holds after you say it." She studied him with those amber and gold eyes for a long moment. He held her gaze without offering anything to fill the space. The space was hers to fill or not. "You are a strange man, Instructor Doran," she said at last. "Rael," he said, "we're past instructor." Something shifted in her expression, carefully, like a very precise door opening just a centimeter. Not cautiously, with intention. "Rael," she repeated, testing the shape of it, the way she tested anything new, with her full attention on whether it was true. The 3rd month brought the first external evaluation. Fleet Command sent a pair of assessors from the Standards Division, a Kethani major named Veth, and a human lieutenant named Calro who carried a datapad and the expression of someone who had done this 40 times and expected nothing new. They spent 2 days observing, ran the standard assessment battery, and on the third morning held their debrief in Rail's office. Calro read from the datapad without inflection. Vale Ssyrith's conditioning scores were, he reported, within normal operating parameters for active duty. Within normal, Rail said. Yes, she's cleared the baseline. What percentile? Calro scrolled, 63rd, which is. What did she score 3 months ago? The lieutenant scrolled further, 21st. So she moved 42 percentile points in 3 months and you're reporting, within normal parameters. The threshold for active duty restoration is. I'm not asking about the threshold. Rail leaned forward. I'm asking whether you understand what you actually watched this week. Major Veth, who had been silent until now, cleared his throat. The improvement is noted, instructor, but the remedial program has a 12-month mandate. We'll return for the 6-month review. Fine, Rail said. Come back at 6 months. She'll be in a different category entirely. They left. Rail went to find Vale and told her the assessment result. She was quiet for a moment, that particular quality of quiet that had changed over 3 months, the silence of someone thinking hard rather than bracing themselves. They weren't impressed, she said. They weren't watching for what matters. He paused. It matters. She looked at him. You've said that before in different words. It's worth repeating. Most things you say are only said once. This one gets an exception. The amber in her eyes had a warmth in it that he was increasingly careful not to look at for too long, because it was the kind of warmth that had started affecting his thinking in ways that were not entirely appropriate for a training relationship. He filed that away in a location. He had marked asterisk not yet and walked her to the evening drill. In the 4th month, she fought the Kethani. Not Major Veth, a garrison soldier named Hall who had been stationed at Viridian 9 for 3 months, and who made a habit, on off-shift evenings, of wandering into the training yard to watch the drills and occasionally offering opinions no one had requested. He was large and confident, and had a particular way of watching Vale that Rail had clocked early and filed in a different location entirely, under asterisk deal with this. It came to a head on a Thursday. Hall had said something to Vale near the weapons rack, low-voiced enough that Rail, crossing the yard with a training log under his arm, only caught the last of it. For a remedial case, almost looks like you belong here. The tone was the thing. Not hostile exactly, worse than hostile, which would have been direct and answerable. It was the proprietary condescension of someone who believed he was being generous. Vale had gone still with the particular precision of someone converting anger into geometry. Rail knew that stillness. He'd been watching it for 4 months, the way her entire system went quiet when something required a decision about how to respond. In the early weeks, that stillness had led to withdrawal. Now it led to something else. Sparring match, Rail said, arriving between them. He looked at Hall. You and her, full gear now. Hall blinked. He was, Rail supposed, not an unintelligent man. He recalibrated fast enough, reading the tone. Then he smiled, which told you everything you needed to know about him. If the program is offering. I'm offering, Vale said, and her voice was like a clean blade drawn from a very cold scabbard. They kidded up. Rail stood at the edge of the marked floor and called the start and stepped back. He had known, by then, what Vale was. 4 months of watching had made it as clear as anything he'd observed in 15 years of this work. He knew it in the way she moved when she forgot to hold herself back. He knew it in the precision of her spatial assessment, the instinctive reading of a space, and all the possible angles in it that she did automatically now without realizing she was doing it. He knew it in the quality of her attention during tactical briefings, the way her eyes went slightly distant when she was seeing a scenario in 3 dimensions, rather than listening to someone else describe it flat. She fought the way water moved through rock, finding the negative space, the joint that wasn't quite square, the weight distribution that couldn't compensate fast enough. She was not stronger than Hall. She was faster, more precise, and she understood leverage in a way that his larger frame had never needed to learn, because leverage was the solution when force wasn't an option. She had spent 12 years being told she lacked force. What she had developed instead was something that made force unnecessary. She was also, Rail noticed, not angry. Not showing him anything that could be read as aggression, which would have given Hall something to push against. She was simply, quietly efficient. He lasted 6 minutes. That was longer than Rail had expected. Hall was experienced, and he was big, and he figured it out eventually. He just figured it out about 45 seconds too late. When she pinned him, her knee in his back, his arm at an angle that was one careful increment from a fracture, there was complete silence in the training yard. A dozen soldiers had gathered without anyone quite deciding to, drawn by that particular quality of attention that forms around something worth watching. They were, Rail noted, all very quiet. The kind of quiet that comes when a room has to revise a collective assumption very quickly. Vale held the pin for a precise 3 count, enough to be unambiguous, not a second more, and let Hall up. She didn't say anything. She stripped her sparring gloves, walked to the weapons rack, set down her gear in its place, and looked at Rail. The expression on her face was not triumph. It was something quieter than that, something that lived on the far side of the fight, the particular look of someone who has just had a very important thing confirmed. "This is what I am," it said, clear as any words. "I just needed to know for certain." "Good form on the shoulder lock," he said. She almost smiled. "I was telegraphing." "Not this time." Ka, standing nearby with his arms crossed and his mouth slightly open, said, "She," and then stopped. He didn't seem to have a noun ready for the end of that sentence. "Mess at 1800, Rail said, to no one in particular, and walked away. The 6-month review came back with different numbers. Calro had a new expression this time, not bored, not exactly stunned, but the specific look of someone recalibrating. He read the combat assessment scores and stopped twice and looked up and read them again. Vale had placed in the 91st percentile for her species in close quarters combat. In tactical assessment, a written component, scenarios and response design, she had placed 97th. Across all combined metrics, she was, the report said, in the top tier for active duty candidates. "This is," Calro paused. "Accurate," Rail said. "We'll need to run confirmatory assessments. These numbers suggest a processing error." "Run them," Rail said. "She'll get the same scores." They did run them, she did. When the confirmatory results came back, something shifted in the coalition's bureaucratic machinery. You could feel it, even at the remove of Veridian 9, the slight vibration of an institution being surprised. The 3rd Fleet Personnel Division filed a query. The Remedial Program Standards Committee filed a request for Rail's methodology documentation. 2 separate garrison commanders sent inquiries about availability of the trainee for assignment. Rail put every one of those in a file and closed the file and went to find Vale. She was in the training yard, running the circuit. The outpost sun was going down and turning the red dust amber, and she was moving through the obstacle course in the long, fluid, water-over-stone way she'd developed over 6 months. Faster now than she'd been yesterday, marginally, and she would be faster tomorrow. He was used to watching her by now, and it still did something to his attention that he had mostly stopped fighting. She finished the circuit and pulled up next to him, breathing evenly. She looked at the sky. "Results came," she said. "Yes. 3 inquiries for assignment." "How did you know about that?" "Koss told me. He saw the message queue header when he was in the admin bay." She paused. He seemed proud of himself for finding out. "He shouldn't have been in the admin bay." "No, but there was something in the way she said it, the slight softening of the word that made him suspect she found this mildly endearing. She'd grown easier with the others over 6 months. Not warm in the way some people were warm. She remained careful, precise, deliberate, but she had stopped holding them at the careful remove of someone who expected rejection. They had, in their turn, stopped treating her as a curiosity and started treating her as Vale. She turned to look at him. What happens now? You have 6 months left on the program mandate. After that, you can take an assignment. Any assignment. Any assignment you want, he paused. There are options that will be offered. I have an opinion about which ones you should consider if you want it. I want it. He was quiet for a moment, choosing his words. There's a special operations unit out of the 7th Fleet. Reconstituted 2 years ago. The commander is a woman named Tharissa Vel. She's one of the veterans from the archival footage I showed you. She builds small teams, mixed species, unconventional engagements. She has been, I'm told, looking for vel-kethara candidates for a while. He paused. The selection process is difficult, Vale said. Brutal. Appropriate, she said, and there was something in the word that was entirely without irony. The satisfaction of wanting the measure to be real. He looked at her. She was looking at the sky, the last of the sun catching her markings and the angle of her cheekbones, and she looked nothing at all like the woman who had come down the transport ramp 6 months ago. Or perhaps, and this was the thought he kept returning to, she looked exactly like that woman, except now the woman was complete. Vale, he said. She looked at him. He should have said, I'll send you a reference letter. I'll tell them what I saw, something professional. He was, after all, still technically her instructor. What he said was, Are you glad you came here? She considered that for a long moment, with the kind of consideration she gave to everything, not hesitation, but real thought. When I came here, she said carefully, I thought I was being discarded. The last stop before being told I was finished. She paused. I was not glad. I had closed myself around the idea that this was the end of what I was allowed to be. And now? She turned to face him fully, and her eyes in the dying light were warm amber, the threads of gold in them catching the last of the sun. Now, she said, I think someone sent me exactly where I needed to be, and I am trying to decide whether that was luck or whether you are better at your work than you let people believe. Couldn't it be both? It could be both, she agreed. And she smiled at him, a real smile, not careful, not guarded, and it was the first time he'd seen all of it at once, and it hit him somewhere in the chest with a precision that would have made her proud. He looked away first. Mess at 1800, he said, which was the stupidest thing he had said in recent memory, but it was what came out. Rail. He looked back. Thank you, she said, not with the weight of something owed, not the gratitude of someone who'd been rescued, with the simplicity of one person saying a true thing to another. You didn't do what they do, when you could have. You didn't make me small. You were never small, he said. They just lied about it. The last 6 months moved differently. Vale was no longer a remedial trainee. She was, and the outpost had quietly reorganized its understanding of this without anyone making an announcement, the best combatant on Veridian 9. The distinction had settled in the way these things did in small postings, not with ceremony, but with a shift in how people oriented toward her in a room. She had stopped being the subject of watchful uncertainty and become, without fanfare, a reference point. Rail began using her in advanced drills with the other trainees, and she was good at teaching, natural at it, with the patience of someone who remembered exactly what it felt like to not understand yet. She did not talk down to them. She did not perform authority. She had a way of watching a trainee's form and then standing beside them and simply doing it correctly once, slowly, not demonstrating exactly. Showing. There was a difference and the trainees felt it. Kas, who had overcome his left leg entirely, and was now developing a secondary problem with his elbow that he hadn't told anyone about yet, and that Rael was giving him 3 more days to mention before saying something. Told Rael one evening that he thought he understood combat differently now that Vale had explained certain things. He said it in the tone of someone reporting a scientific finding. She makes it make sense, Koss said, not the rules of it. The reason behind the rules. That's how it works, Rael said, when the person teaching it knows why, not just what. She knows why, Koss agreed with quiet certainty. He kept designing sessions. She kept arriving to them already having run through the concepts on her own, which meant they spent a great deal of their training time in something that was harder to categorize, part tactical problem-solving, part sparring, part argument. She disagreed with him openly now, and correctly often enough that he'd stopped being surprised by it. She was right about the defensive formation variance. He conceded that in writing, which he filed in his methodology notes because the standards committee would want it, and because it was true. She was right about the failure mode on the coalition's standard unarmed combat curriculum, which she had documented in a 3-page analysis she'd written in her off hours and handed to him without comment, and which he'd read twice and sent to the coalition's training division under her name with a cover note that said it was worth their attention. She was, he told her once, going to have opinions about everything eventually. I always had opinions, she said. I was taught they didn't count. They were wrong. Yes, she said, and then in the same breath without any pause, block. He blocked barely. She countered a sweep that came from below his center of gravity, using the exact blind spot she'd identified in his right-hand defense during a session 3 weeks ago, and had apparently been patient enough to wait for. And he went down on one knee in the red dust, which was, he reflected, an occupational hazard of training someone until they were better than you. She put a hand down, not to help him up but to be level with him, and looked at him from very close. Her markings were lit faintly along her jaw in the late afternoon. I see it now, she said, before I even start, the gaps. She wasn't only talking about the sparring match. Or she was, but she was also talking about something else, something that encompassed the sparring match in the training yard and all 12 months of it. It's like a language. They were trying to teach me words in a language I don't speak when I have a whole other one they didn't know. They thought the problem was vocabulary. It was the language itself. He stood up. She stood up with him, and they were close in the dust and the late light, and he had been carefully not standing this close for months now, managing the distance with the quiet precision of someone navigating around something he knew was there, and had decided needed a proper acknowledgement, when the time was right, rather than an accidental one. What language? He asked. Whatever this is, she said. What you showed me. What you, she stopped, looked at him with the gold thread eyes, and he could see her choosing the words, careful and precise as always. What I am when no one has decided for me what I can be. Vale. I know, she said quietly. I know what I'm saying it deliberately. He was quiet for a very long time. The training yard was empty except for them, the dust settling around their feet, the outpost's lights beginning to flick on as the evening came down, one by one, the way they always did on Viridian 9, the security lights first and then the workspace lights, and then the faint amber warm of the mess hall windows. He had watched this happen every evening for more than a year now. He knew the order. He knew the sounds, the generator hum shifting pitch as the load changed, the way the cooling air off the desert smelled faintly of minerals he'd never been able to name. He had become, without quite noticing, comfortable here in a way he hadn't expected to be. He suspected that had something to do with the person standing in front of him. The program ends in 6 weeks, he said. Yes. And you'll be placed with the 7th Fleet Special Operations Unit, if the selection goes the way it's going to go. Yes. And I'm stationed here for another standard year. Yes, she held his gaze without flinching. I know all of this. I'm saying it so I've said it, Rael said, So the math is clear. Because the way I feel about you is not a training relationship thing, and it hasn't been for a while, and it would be wrong not to say so. That would be the kind of thing I'd regret not saying. He paused. But the math is what it is, and I wanted to name it rather than leave it unnamed. She looked at him for a long moment with the full, careful attention she gave to everything that mattered to her. The same attention she had given the obstacle course on the third day, the archival footage in the media room, the combat scenarios she ran and reran in her head before she could articulate why they didn't work. It was, he had come to understand, the opposite of dismissal. It was the deepest form of interest she had. Humans, she said finally, are very concerned with the math. Aren't you? I'm concerned with what's true. She took one step closer, which put them in the particular proximity that he had been carefully managing for months. Here is what's true. In 6 weeks the program ends. In 8 weeks I'll be at selection. In 12 weeks you'll receive a posting reassignment. Yes, I know about it. Cass had the message queue header again. I'm aware. That puts you within the same command corridor as the 7th Fleet. He blinked. How do you know about the reassignment? I asked Commander Tharissa Vel if there was a position for a human combat specialist in her corridor, Vale said, with an almost preternatural composure, the particular calm of someone who had spent considerable time arranging something and was now unveiling it with complete equanimity. She said yes. I suggested your name. I sent her your methodology documentation and your record and the Standards Committee's evaluation notes. She filed the request. He stared at her. You are the best instructor in this program, she said. She needed a good one. The math works. A pause, the gold in her eyes catching the first emerging stars through the outpost's dome, that particular Viridian 9 sky that turned deep violet before it went to black. Unless you object. Vale. Unless you object, she repeated quietly, you are going to be a very short distance away. And when the program is done, when you are my instructor in nothing but the technicality of title for 6 more weeks, you will be a short distance away and I will have said what I said. She paused. I have become someone I did not know I could be. I know exactly who did that. I am telling you that I know. I am not going to not say it because the timeline is inconvenient. He reached up carefully, slowly, giving her time to read his intent before he acted, and touched the side of her face. Just his fingertips, along her jaw, where the vel-kethara markings ran faint and iridescent in the outpost lights. She went still. Not with surprise, with reception, with that quality of complete attention turned inward. The markings brightened under his fingers. The physiological response she'd explained to him once, months ago, in a session about the vel-kethara and environments with variable thermal profiles, in a context she had maintained was purely informational. Thermal and emotional response, she had said, very carefully neutral, looking at a point past his shoulder. Involuntary. The species has no control over it. And then she had moved on to the next topic, and he had filed it carefully in the location marked * not yet. 6 weeks, he said. 6 weeks, she agreed. Her hand came up and covered his, keeping it where it was. Her hand was warm, the way all of her ran warm, and she didn't hold his hand so much as simply place hers there, keeping him in contact. And then you are no longer my instructor, and I will have opinions about many things. You already have opinions about many things. Yes, she said, but then they will include you specifically, and I will be allowed to say so out loud, and I will, the ghost of a smile. Often. I believe you, Rael said. And the lights finished coming on, and the desert cooled around them, and they stood in the dust of Viridian 9, and held still in the middle of what they had made of a transfer notice that had said, in its own clean, bureaucratic way, that she was not worth the trouble. The selection process for the 7th Fleet Special Operations Unit took 19 days. Rael wasn't there for it. He was at Viridian 9, finishing the rotation, filing his methodology documentation for the Standards Committee, reading the reassignment orders that had arrived exactly as Vale had predicted. He received one message from her, on day 11. They put us through the Veth corridor scenario. I won't describe it, you'll read the assessment, but I want to tell you that I heard your voice in my head the whole time, not the things you said. The way you looked at me when I did something right, like it was real, like I was real. A pause in the text then. I don't know if that's strange to say. He wrote back, it's not strange. How's your shoulder rotation? Her reply was, perfect, obviously. On day 19, she sent a second message. It said, selected. I am told I scored highest in the cohort on the tactical assessment. Tharissa Vel says to tell you she knew you could do it. I told her you didn't do it. She said that was the same thing. I disagreed. I think she understood why. Then reporting for duty in 4 weeks. Your corridor rail, 4 weeks. He read it twice, set down his coffee, went to the window. Outside, Koss was running the circuit, left leg sorted, head up, faster than he'd been yesterday. 4 weeks, Rail said to the empty office, and the dust outside caught the early light, and something in him that had been holding a breath for a very long time let it go. When she came through the corridor airlock at Outpost Meridian 4, her new posting, his new posting, the 7th Fleet corridor with its particular kind of gray-green starlight that came through the station viewports at a slant. She was in Unit Blacks, the Special Operations insignia at her shoulder, and she moved through the crowd at the docking bay with the easy confidence of someone who had stopped performing for anyone. He was standing at the edge of the bay. She saw him from 20 meters out. He saw her see him. She closed the distance in 10 steps and stopped in front of him, and they looked at each other in the way they had looked at each other 100 times over 12 months, and now could do for the last time before it became something else entirely. Program ended yesterday, she said. I know. You are no longer my instructor. I'm aware. I have opinions, she said, and her eyes were warm and gold and entirely serious. I know that too, he said. Good, said Vale Ssyrith, and she was smiling that full, unguarded smile he'd first seen in the red dust with the stars coming down, and she reached up and took his face in her hands, and that was that. What the 3rd Fleet eventually filed, in its official record, was a correction. Transfer notation, Vale Ssyrith, vel-kethara, female, adult, original recommendation. Administrative reassignment or honorable discharge, correction. Error in original assessment. Trainee demonstrated exceptional capability across all combat and tactical metrics. Return to active duty at enhanced grade. Assigned Special Operations Unit, 7th Fleet. Commander Haveth Drawl, who signed the correction with the expression of a man eating something that didn't agree with him, filed no additional comment. The Standards Committee, reviewing the methodology documentation that Rail submitted, circulated an internal memo suggesting that the human remedial program should consider expanding its intake criteria. 2 members submitted a secondary memo suggesting the methodology should be adopted as a model for the wider vel-kethara training cohort. A third submitted a note pointing out that this would require admitting that a human instructor at a remote outpost had identified a structural failure in the Coalition's training curriculum. The debate took 6 months and was resolved by being quietly tabled. At the 7th Fleet Special Operations Unit, Vale made lieutenant inside her first operational year. Her first 3 engagements were classified at the level that meant Rail heard about them through the particular channel of people who said asterisk, you have no idea what your person did out there, with an expression like they'd seen something that reorganized their understanding of what was possible. He admitted to her once, a fairly good idea. She was lying next to him in the narrow bunk of a station quarters room, and the starlight through the viewport was the gray-green of Meridian 4, and she turned to look at him with the gold thread eyes he'd learned to read like a language he hadn't known he was studying. I think about Viridian 9, she said. Good memories. She was quiet for a moment. I think about the person who came down that ramp, how close she was, how certain she was that this was the end. She paused. I want to go back to her and tell her something. What? That the man waiting at the bottom of the ramp is not what she thinks he is. That what he's about to do is not what she thinks it is. She turned on her side to face him. That she should pay attention, that she is about to be found. Rael was quiet. Found is the right word, she said. Not made, not fixed, found. He reached across and touched her jaw, the same place he'd first touched her in the dust, the markings warm and bright in the quiet. And she closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them, they were full of the particular warmth that was only ever for him. You were always there, he said. Yes, said Vale Ssyrith, who was the best fighter in the 7th Fleet Corridor and the most feared operator Commander Tharissa Vel had ever trained, and who had been discarded once by people who couldn't see past the shape of the box they'd put her in. Yes. I was. In the 2nd year, they sent a recruiter from the Standards Committee to Meridian 4. He was looking for Vale, which was the thing that happened now. People came looking for Vale, wanted to know how she'd been trained, wanted to know if Rael could replicate what he'd done. The recruiter was polite and methodical, and he sat in the briefing room with a datapad and a series of questions, and at the end of his list he put down the datapad and said, When she arrived at Veridian 9, when you first saw the transfer notice, did you think you could do this? Rael considered the question. I thought she could do it, he said. That's not the same thing. No, he agreed, but it's the only part that mattered. The recruiter wrote something down, then he looked up. She told me, when I interviewed her for this assessment, that you were the only person who looked at her and saw something different from what the file said. Rael was quiet for a moment. The file was wrong. You knew that from a transfer notice. I knew that from the way she came off the ramp. He paused, thinking of it, the watchful eyes, the worn bag, the composure of someone who expected the worst and refused to show it. She was being careful. Careful people have things worth protecting. They don't protect nothing. He shrugged. The file said fragile. What I saw was someone who'd been fighting her own ceiling for years and was tired of pretending it was the sky. The recruiter stared at him. Write it down if you want, Rael said. Or don't, it's not a method. It's just, you have to look at what's actually there. She won the Coalition's dual field commendation in the 3rd year. It was the highest operational honor available to an active service special operations officer, and it had been awarded 11 times in 40 years, and the ceremony was at the Central Command Station in Sector 1. Rael was there because she had told him to be, with the same pleasant certainty she used for everything that had already been decided. He stood at the edge of the formal hall and watched her receive it. She was in full dress blacks, her markings bright against the pale copper of her skin, her head up, her posture easy, not the rigid correctness of someone performing confidence, but the simple uprightness of someone who had nothing left to prove. Commander Tharissa Vel gave the commendation address, and in it, she said that warrior Vale Ssyrith had demonstrated capacities that redefined the operational ceiling for vel-kethara fighters and set a standard that the unit was still measuring itself against. There was applause, there were cameras. Vale accepted the commendation with a nod that was gracious and just slightly dry. She had become, over 3 years, quietly comfortable with being impressive. And when the formal portion ended and the room reorganized itself into something approaching a reception, she crossed directly to where Rael was standing. Satisfied, she said. Were you ever in doubt? Once, she said, at the start. She tilted her head. But someone told me the ceiling wasn't real. So I took it off. He looked at her, all of her, the commendation at her chest, the 3 years in her eyes, the person she had been when they'd stood in red dust, and she had not yet learned the word for what she was. You always could, he said. She stepped forward into his space, with the easy authority of someone who was exactly where she was supposed to be, and she was going to say something. He could tell by the particular set of her jaw, the small gathering before words. What she said was, "Rail, take me home," which was not Veridian 9, and was not Meridian 4, and was not any particular set of coordinates. It was, as both of them understood it, a direction rather than a place. The same direction they had been moving since a transport ramp and a worn bag, and a man at the bottom of it who had made the simple, revolutionary decision to see what was actually there. "Yes," said Rail Doran. And they left the reception and the cameras and the formal hall, and behind them, in the room full of people who'd been told what she was and found out how wrong they were, someone laughed, and someone raised a glass, and Commander Tharissa Vel said to no one in particular, "She always was the strongest one in any room she was in. Someone just had to believe it first." Nobody wrote that part down. They didn't need to. Vale already knew.